You found your way here again. Good. Pull the covers up a little higher. Turn the lights down if you haven't already. I've been waiting. My name doesn't matter much. What matters is what I know. And what I know, I've spent a long time digging up from places most folks don't go. Hollows with no names on the map. Ridges the old-timers refuse to talk about come nightfall. Places where the fog sits a little too still, and the smoke from a fire bends the wrong direction. Tonight, I've got 6 of them for you. 6 stories pulled from the dark corners of the archives. Tales of people who worked with their hands in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Who made things, shaped things, things that didn't stay the way they were made. You don't need to be afraid, probably. Just close your eyes and let the dark in slow. Welcome back to the Redacted archives. This next one comes from deep in the Appalachian hills. Never been solved. Probably never will be. Listen close. There's a smell to a hollow in October. Not a bad smell. Not exactly. It's just old. Like something wet that has been drying for 1,000 years and hasn't quite finished the job yet. Wet limestone. Wet root. That particular rot of tulip poplar bark after 3 days of rain. A smell I can only describe as the color dark orange, if that means anything to you. Ash Hollow sits 9 miles off Route 421. Up a fire road the county stopped grading around 1987. You take it slow. The ruts'll catch a tire, and there's a drainage wash on the left side that drops 30 feet into a creek bed full of angular chert. The kind of rock that doesn't weather round. It just fractures, smaller and smaller, until it's grit in the clay. I drove up on a Sunday, the 14th of September. The contract came through a forestry subcontractor out of Boone. 30-day engagement. Tend 6 earthen mounds in an active charcoal production site. Simple work, the kind I'd done twice before. Once in Watauga County, once in Unicoi, and it suited me. I am not by nature a man who requires company. The mounds were already stacked when I arrived. 6 of them, arranged in 2 rows of 3 like a sentence with a comma in the middle. Each one roughly 12 feet high and 20 feet across at the base. That slightly irregular shape that good mound work always has. Because you're not building a perfect dome. You're building a breathing thing. You have to leave it room to settle. The wood was black birch, Betula lenta, dense, fine-grained, the heartwood almost purple in cross-section. Stack it correctly, large rounds at the base, splits radiating outward like wheel spokes, and it will burn 14 days without being fully rebuilt. You just tend it. Watch the smoke. Learn what each color means. White smoke, moisture leaving, good. Yellow smoke, the temperature has climbed too high, the clay is cracking. Move. Slow, deliberate. Blue smoke, that thin thread rising from a vent hole in the late afternoon. That means you're in the middle stage. The wood is converting, giving up its water and lighter gases, condensing into pure carbon. It's a kind of dying. The wood is becoming something else. The clay on these mounds had been applied 2 or 3 days before I arrived. Not cracked yet. Still that dark bruise gray, and when I pressed my palm flat against the nearest one, I could feel the heat beneath it. Steady, slow, like a pulse that had been running a long time. Inside the tool shed, 2 long-handled clay spades, a barrow, a propane lantern, and a logbook for recording mound temperatures and smoke conditions every 4 hours. The logbook was pre-formatted. Pages and pages of identical grids. The entries from the previous tenders stopped on August 19th. The last one, in handwriting that had gotten noticeably smaller over the preceding 2 weeks, read simply, "Blue smoke, northwest vent, saturation nominal." I didn't know what that meant at the time. The fog came up thick each morning from the creek. By 7 o'clock it would be sitting in the hollow like something poured into a bowl, dense, white, slightly luminous, smelling of iron and cold stone and the sweetness of wet black birch bark. The ridgeline disappeared. The sourwood and red maple along the upper slopes went gray, and then gray-white, and then nothing. I was alone in a white room with 6 slow fires. I found a rhythm. Most men do in this kind of work, if they let themselves. Wake, walk, record, tend, sleep a few hours, wake again. The body adjusts. The mind gets quiet, quieter than it gets most other ways. There is a particular satisfaction in this kind of attention. The mounds are patient with you. They don't demand anything sudden. They just ask that you show up every 4 hours and pay attention. And when you do, when you notice that the southeast vent on Mound 1 needs to open 2 fingers wider, or that the clay on the northwest face of Mound 4 has a hairline crack forming along the 3rd course, and you correct it, and the smoke color shifts back toward right. There is a steadiness in that, a sense of things held in balance by careful, repeated work. I understand now why that feeling was useful to someone other than me. It was on the 6th day that I found the hardware. I was digging out a slow clay leak on the northeast face of Mound 2 when my spade hit something that was not rock and was not root. Once, then again, more carefully. I went to my knees and cleared the clay by hand. A cast iron pipe, tainted with a dull black paint gone chalky with age, about 4 inches in diameter. It emerged from beneath the base of the mound and ran horizontally through the earth, heading north toward the limestone cliff that formed the back wall of the site. I followed it. About 40 yards from the mound, the pipe disappeared into the base of the limestone, into a crack mortared over with failing cement and furred with orange-black lichen. At the junction, an iron collar flanged and bolted where the cast iron met a second pipe lined with lead. The lining was visible at the joint, thick and gray, because whoever assembled this fitting had not been careful about concealing it. I pressed my hand against the limestone. It was warm from below, from within, a steady, dry heat with no weather in it, traveling up from somewhere much deeper than the hollow floor. Not the warmth of something recently heated, the warmth of something that has been running a long time and will continue running long after anything on the surface is gone. I held my hand there for a while, then I pulled it away. I went back to my work, resealed the Mound 2 crack, made my rounds, ate supper, and sat on the step of the shed watching the fog come in. But I was thinking about that pipe. Lead-lined pipes don't filter fuel. They filter things that are chemically aggressive, things that would corrode unprotected metal. The second thing I noticed that same 6th evening was the shape at the edge of Mound 5. The fog was heavy. My lantern lit maybe 10 feet. Beyond that, gray gauze. I was checking the upper vents when I saw a figure standing in the smoke. A vertical shape about the height of a man, but thicker in the trunk. And still, not the stillness of a man waiting, but the stillness of something that does not need to move. I said, "Hello." Nothing. 3 steps toward it and it was gone. Or rather, the smoke shifted and there was no longer a shape in it. I made a note. Possible visual disturbance due to fatigue and smoke density. 7:42 p.m. I saw the shape again at 11 o'clock and at 4 in the morning. I had started calling them the stump men, because that is what they resembled. Old hardwood stumps that have been in the ground 20 years, taken on that hunched, organic dignity that wood gets when it's slowly becoming soil. Dense, patient, always in the warmest channels of smoke, always still. I should have left on the 7th day. On the 9th day it rained for 14 hours, cold and gray, without force, just presence. I spent most of it inside the tool shed, running temperature probes, listening to rain on corrugated metal. I was searching the back shelves for a spare probe gasket when I found the second logbook. Behind a false back panel on the lowest shelf. Not well hidden. The panel just didn't sit flush. The logbook was taped to the inside face with old gummed tape that had nearly let go. The cover read, Project Seepage, Field Documentation, Site AH6, not for distribution. The first thing I understood was the geography. Hand-drawn cross-section maps of the Hollow's geology. Ash Hollow sits over a karst formation, limestone riddled with solution channels, the kind of Swiss cheese geology common to the Blue Ridge uplands of Avery County. Below the karst, labeled at approximately 1,400 feet, the Pottsville coal seam. And running upward through the karst voids, a series of arrows labeled seepage vectors, active. The second thing I understood was the substance. The logbook called it the breath of the marrow throughout, always italicized, like a proper name. A subterranean gas, geogenic in origin, produced by anaerobic conversion of deeply sequestered organic material at the formation boundary. Colorless, near odorless at low concentrations, with a faint metallic sweet quality at higher levels, heavier than air. It pooled in basins. It collected in hollows. Capable, at sustained exposure above 40 parts per million, of mimicking progressive cognitive decline indistinguishable from early-stage dementia. Confusion, memory fragmentation, the dissolution of sequential time. At 200 parts per million and above, cellular conversion. A marginal note in a second hand read simply, carbon densification of soft tissue. See Appendix C. There was no Appendix C. The third thing I understood was the system. The karst voids were releasing the breath of the marrow in slow pressure events, following solution channels upward and emerging through cracks in the limestone face at the north end of the hollow. The hollow's basin geometry ensured the gas pooled reliably at the bottom. The site had been chosen not for its timber or its clay. It had been chosen because it was a collection basin that needed to be managed. Activated charcoal is among the most efficient filtration media known. A properly maintained earthen mound, burning at the correct temperature, generates a continuous column of self-renewing activated carbon. The lead-lined pipes delivered the breath of the marrow from the limestone face into the base of each burning mound, where the gas was, per the logbook, approximately 94% neutralized before venting upward. Approximately 94%. The remaining 6% was what you breathed standing next to the mounds every 4 hours. The tender was not employed to tend the mounds. The tender was the secondary filter. Page 47. A table. Biological absorption efficiency, series AH subjects. 12 prior tenders listed back to 1971. Name, start date, weekly exposure measurements, biological absorption readings, and an end date for each. And a final column, saturation status. Entries ranged from partial to full to process complete. 3 were marked process complete. Mound 3, the one slightly larger than the others, the one running a few degrees warmer than its probe reading should have produced, had construction dates that corresponded to 2 of those 3 entries. And at the bottom of the table, a new row. My name. Start date, September 14th. Projected saturation date, October 15th. October 15th. I'm telling you this on the evening of October 14th. I know that because the calendar on my phone still functions, even though I stopped trusting my own sense of sequential time around the 3rd week. Days would double back. I'd find myself at a mound I was certain I'd just left, with no memory of the walk between. I'd read entries in my logbook and not recognize that I'd written them, not because the handwriting changed, but because the memory of forming those words was simply gone. Frames removed from a film. The remaining story still seems to flow. You only know something's missing if you already knew what belonged there. The logbook is thick with entries now. 30 days of temperature readings, smoke color assessments, vent adjustments. Every 4 hours, every day. I kept the work up because by a certain point the rhythm of it was the only thing that still felt like solid ground. Possibly because past a certain saturation level I lacked the sequential capacity to form a plan of departure. One note in the project seepage margins, in that second hand, read, "Subject continues to perform conditioned tasks above 70% saturation." I've thought about that sentence quite a bit. I went to my truck on day 11. The battery was dead. The tank was empty, though I'd filled it in Newland before driving up. I stood there for a while with my hand on the door handle, looking back at the mounds, at the slow blue smoke. Then I went back inside. By day 11, the feelings that involve urgency had become very difficult to find. There are headlights on the ridge, 2 of them, very white, very steady. moving at the pace of a vehicle that is not hurrying. I can hear the engine now, that diesel idol of a Forest Service truck, patient and certain. I know what will happen. 2 men will get out, standard field clothes, indistinguishable from any other forestry personnel. They will carry clipboards. They will walk the mounds, and then one of them will come to the shed. It's in the logbook. The procedure for a tender reaching saturation status. The paperwork is called Form 7C, described only as Integration Intake Documentation. That word, integration, does all the work while giving you nothing to hold. I want to tell you what I feel right now, because I think it's the only useful thing I have left. I feel quiet, the way the hollow feels at 4 in the morning when the fog has settled and the mounds are all running blue smoke, and the creek has dropped to something you can barely separate from silence. I feel like wood in the middle stage, the water gone, the lighter things gone, just the carbon structure remaining, dense and patient, ready to become something it did not start out as. If someone finds this, I set it to upload on a timed delay because I still had that much sequence left in me. I want to tell you 3 things. First, Ash Hollow is in Avery County, off Route 421. There is a cairn of church stones at the Fire Road turnoff. Someone places that cairn and someone maintains it. Do not go there. The hollow collects. That is what it is for. Second, if you tend any slow fire in a mountain basin with a limestone wall, and the smoke carries something almost sweet, almost metallic, something you keep almost catching and then losing, leave before the stillness starts to feel like home, before the 4-hour rounds feel like the natural rhythm of a day. Comfortable is how it begins. Third, the stump men. I know what they are now. The breath of the marrow, at concentration sufficient for cellular conversion, does not complete rapidly. There is a middle stage, and during the middle stage what remains is oriented toward heat, toward the mounds, the way a compass responds to a field, not by choice, but because it has been made into something that responds. They are not standing in the smoke. They are standing in the warmth, near the mounds they once tended, in the hollow where the temperature is right. And they have not gone anywhere because they have been made into the kind of thing that stays. There are 6 mounds in the hollow tonight. Come morning, there will still be 6. But mound 3 will be slightly larger than it was. Get some sleep. The fires are all tended. And if you smell something sweet in a mountain hollow, something you almost catch and then lose, don't breathe deep. Don't breathe deep. What I'm about to tell you was passed down for generations before it found its way to me. The mountains keep their secrets long, but not forever. He came up out of the fog like wet paper being peeled off a cold stone wall. That's the only way I ever could describe it to anybody who wasn't there. Like something that had been pressed flat, pressed under the weight of all that white mist for days, until the shape of him wasn't quite right no more. His fingers was too long. His neck tilted at an angle no neck ought to tilt at. And when the boy reached out and touched his father's face, it felt like limestone, cold and damp and faintly gritty, like the mountain itself had been trying to absorb him. The winch on that cliff screamed, iron on iron, rust scraping rust, and the cable pulled taut as a fiddle string in January. And something else came up with him, something that had been in those deep fog pools a whole lot longer than any man ought to be. Stay under your quilt now. We'll get to it. This is case file 084, the Fog-Dredger of Omen Ridge. Before I can tell you about the captain, I gotta tell you about the fog. If you don't understand the fog the way the old-timers understood it, the way people born in these hollows understood it in their bones, then nothing that follows is gonna make sense. Most folks from the flatlands think of fog as weather. They say it'll burn off by 9. They say it's atmospheric moisture. In the flatlands, reckon they're right enough. But up here on the high limestone ridges, up where the Appalachians get old and gray and mean, the fog is something else entirely. The mountain people called it the Air River, not cloud, not mist. A river, because it moves like one. It has a current. You stand on the edge of a ridge at first light, that time we call the twilight, when the dark and the day are still arguing, and you watch the fog come rolling through the gaps in the rock, and you'll see it. The way it eddies around a boulder, same as water does. The way it pools in the limestone sinks and old quarry cuts, deep and still and perfectly, terribly still. The way it rushes through the narrow cuts between ridges, hard enough to snatch a hat off your head. Some mornings it comes thin and fast, and you can walk right through it and feel nothing but damp. Other mornings, the old-timers call these the heavy mornings. It comes in thick and close, and it presses against your skin like wet wool, and every sound around you goes flat and dead, like you've put your head under a feather tick. Those are the mornings you stay inside, because the heavy fog has deep pools in it. A river has shallows you can wade, and it has deep holes where the current goes cold and dark at the bottom. Holes where a man can lose his footing and not come back up. The Air River has the same. The deep fog pools sit in the limestone hollows and cliff-bottom places where the sun don't reach until 10 in the morning, if it reaches at all. And in those pools, the old-timers said, and I believe 'em, time moves different. Not stopped, just slowed, like cold molasses, like a clock running on a weak spring. A dog might wander into a deep fog pool on a Thursday and come out the next, skinny and confused and smelling of wet iron. A child might step off a path in the fog and step back onto it 3 hours later, even though her mother swore she'd been calling that name for 6. And occasionally, not often, but occasionally, something that went into a deep fog pool didn't come back out at all. Not right away. Not in a way you'd fully recognize. The fog holds things, you see. Not just lost people. The mountain is ancient, older than any name we ever put on it. And over the centuries there is an accumulation, a grief weight. A Civil War soldier who took a wrong turn in the whiteout and never found his regiment. A woman who walked out to fetch water one December morning and was never seen again. Toys, tools, livestock, whole families, swallowed since long before anybody alive today was born. The fog holds 'em, keeps 'em pressed flat in those cold pools like flies in amber, suspended under the weight of all that white air, waiting for something to come down and pull 'em up. That's where the captain comes in. His name by the record was Elias Cormac Pruitt. He'd spent 43 years on the Ohio and the Kanawha running dredging operations, pulling sand and lost cargo from the river bottoms with cable and winch rigs the size of small houses. When his knees gave out and the company pensioned him off, Captain Pruitt came back to the mountain he'd been born on, back to Omen Ridge, Above the big holler the county maps call Creel's Gap, but which local people just call the Bottom, on account of how long the fog pools in it come morning. He brought his winch with him. Took 6 men and a flatbed truck and most of one August day to haul that iron machine up the switchback road. Neighbors watched and didn't say much, because people on the ridge have learned you let a man do what he's fixin' to do, and you wait. He bolted it to the limestone shelf at the very edge of Omen Ridge, where the cliff drops 200 feet straight down into the bottom. Anchored it with iron pins sunk 2 feet into rock. Ran his cable, 3-inch braided steel, out over the edge and down into the fog. And he went to work. Neighbors heard it before they saw it. The low groan of iron gears, the cable under tension, the slow mechanical heartbeat of the drum rollin', click, 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 in the before-dawn dark. Most left into it, but some, the ones with enough mountain blood to feel a thing before they understand it, started coming up to watch, because the captain was pulling things up. He kept a log, careful and meticulous, same as on the river. Date, time, cable depth, description of item. I have read that log cover to cover. Here are 4 entries I want you to carry with you. The first was a bugle. Brass once. What came up on that cable was the color of old bone, and it dripped cold water that had no business being there on a dry September morning. An insignia stamped into the bell was later identified as a Union regiment that marched this stretch of ridge in the fall of 1863. The captain set it on his table without speaking. The water it dripped pooled on the limestone and didn't evaporate. 3 days later it was still wet, still cold. The second was a child's doll, carved wood, or it had been. When the captain took it in his hands, he said it didn't feel like wood at all. It felt like compressed cloud, like if you pressed a fistful of fog between your palms until it held a shape. A little figure, button eyes, a painted smile blurred with age, light as a breath, cold as a cave. He wrote in the log, retrieved at 127 fathoms. No identifiable era. Feels like it's still wet on the inside. The third was a radio, console style from the 1930s, black with rot, its cloth speaker face the color of old teeth. The captain plugged it into his generator, and the dial lit amber. The needle swung. From that speaker, in the cold morning air on Omen Ridge, came a sound. Not music, not voices, a heartbeat, slow and deep and regular as a grandfather clock. He listened, then unplugged it. He wrote, "Alive or mimicking, cannot determine which." The fourth was the one that made the neighbors stop coming up to watch. The cable came up empty, or appeared to. The hook broke the fog line at the cliff edge with nothing on it, and the captain started winding it in. Then a woman named Bertie Colson said in a voice like she was afraid to startle something, "Captain, look at your shadow." The captain looked down. His shadow was there, long in the morning light, and beside it was another, the shape of a hound, big, deep-chested, sitting on its haunches right next to him. Nothing there to cast it. When Bertie took a step toward it, the captain held up his hand. "Don't make a quick move." He reached down slowly and rested his palm at the height a dog's head would have been. The shadow leaned into his hand. He wrote 4 words in the log. It was glad, released. He never told a soul what he felt against his palm. He took that with him. His name was Harlan Dillard, 22 years old. 4 days into looking for his father when somebody in the bottom sent him up the switchback road. His father, Webb Dillard, 58, a retired timber grader who'd lived in Creel's Gap his whole life, had gone out in a whiteout fog 4 mornings prior to check his trap line. Never came back. Search parties went in. Sheriff's department, neighbors, the boy himself. They found Webb's tracks in the mud at the tree line edge, and then the tracks just stopped. The way tracks stop when the ground turns to flat rock. Fog was still pooled in the low place beyond the tree line, even 4 days on. Heavy fog, pressed against the limestone like still water. Nobody wanted to walk into it. Harlan came up that road just before dusk and found the old man at his winch. Same as always. Cable down in the fog. Gears turning slow. The smell of wet coal and rust heavy on the air, mixed with the cold stone smell of deep fog, like the inside of a well. The boy told him about his father. The captain listened without looking up. When Harlan finished, there was a long silence. Long enough the boy thought the old man wasn't going to speak at all. Then, "I know where he is." The captain changed the cable depth, let it out yard by yard, counting under his breath in the old riverman's way, until he hit a point that made him go still, eyes closed, like a man listening for something just below the range of hearing. He locked the drum and began to haul back. The winch screamed, iron on iron, rust on rust. The sound bounced off the cliff face and came back doubled, and the boy covered his ears. The cable went taut as a banjo string. The limestone shelf vibrated underfoot. The fog at the base of the cliff 200 feet below began to swirl. Not the way fog swirls in wind, but the way water moves when something large is rising through it. Then the shape appeared. It came up out of the fog like wet paper being peeled off a cold stone wall, rising slow and heavy, turning slightly in the gray air. The shape of a man. The shape of Webb Dillard. His size, his coat, his posture. But wrong. The way a photograph of a man is like a man and is not a man. The way a reflection in still dark water looks like a face and is not a face. Harlan grabbed the cliff edge railing and reached over as the shape rose to the level of the shelf. His hands found his father's shoulders and they pulled him over the edge and onto the limestone. And Harlan Dillard's hands told him the truth before his eyes did. Wet paper, cold limestone, the texture of something that had been pressed flat and was now, only now, trying to remember its shape. Skin didn't feel like skin. It felt like rock pulled fresh from a cold creek, gritty and damp and alive the way moss on a stone is alive. Not animal alive, not warm alive, but alive in some slower, older register that the body don't have good words for. The captain worked quickly. He had a wool blanket, dry, smelling of cedar and wood smoke, and he wrapped it around Webb Dillard and spoke in a low voice. Not words Harlan could make out. Old river talk. The kind of language you use when something needs coaxing back to where it belongs. It took about an hour. Color came back slow. Warmth came back slower. Webb blinked. Once, twice, and looked at his son. His face did the thing faces do when a person remembers who they are. Not a smile, more like a loosening. A man letting go of a grip he'd been keeping a long, long time. He never remembered the 4 days. Said it felt like standing in a dark, quiet room, waiting for somebody to open the door. Said it wasn't painful. Said it wasn't frightening. Said it wasn't entirely unpeaceful. That part worried the captain more than anything else, because the fog, the deep pools, they don't hold things through violence or malice. They hold things the way deep, cold water holds things. Gently, passively, in a silence that, after a while, starts to feel like rest. And some things, once they've rested that long in the cold and the quiet and the white, have a hard time wanting to come back to the noise and the warmth and the trouble of being alive. The captain watched Webb Dillard walk down the switchback road with his son until the trees swallowed them. Then he turned back to his winch, let the cable back down into the fog. There were more things to retrieve. There always are. That's case file 084. The Fog-Dredger of Omen Ridge. Captain Pruitt worked that winch for 11 more years after the night Harlan Dillard came up that road. His log runs to 4 volumes. I'll share more of it when the time is right, when the fog is running heavy, and you're settled in the way you're settled in right now. If your screen is showing a playlist called All Night Horror, No Ads, let it run. I put those files together for nights exactly like this one. For when you need the voice to keep going after your eyes close. Let the archive sit with you tonight, neighbor. You don't have to listen alone. This has been Redacted Archives. Case file 084 is closed. For now. There are stories in these hills that the locals don't repeat after dark. This is one of them. It's never been explained. Now settle in. Let the blanket find your shoulders. Let your feet go still. There is nothing out there in the dark that needs your attention tonight. Nothing that cannot wait. I want to tell you about a place called Shatter-Ridge. Most maps don't name it. The ones that do place it a full county east of where it truly sits, up in the laurel-tangled knuckles of the southern Appalachians, where the fog comes in off the ridge line before the birds have bothered to wake, where the hemlock trees drip a cold mineral damp, leaving a smell like wet stone and iron and something the soil keeps beneath its dark tongue and only releases after long rain. Clara Voss came back to Shatter-Ridge in October. She had not been back in 11 years. A person can do that, love a place and still stay away from it, the way you might love a song that makes you ache too deep to hear when you're already low. Clara was 34 now and steady, and she had driven 6 hours with a legal folder containing the last will and testament of her grandfather, Elias Voss, who had passed in September. Quietly, the hospice nurse said, like a candle that had finished its business. She pulled up the gravel lane as dusk gathered at the tree line, violet and gray, pressing close against the cabin windows. The cabin sat at the foot of the ridge, black chinked logs, a tin roof greened by moss, two front windows like half-shut eyes. The yard held Elias's garden, gone to seed, dried stalks of moonflower leaning against each other like old men, their heads bowed. She took her first breath of mountain air on the porch. Damp hemlock, wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney a half hollow away, the mineral cold of creek stone, and beneath all of it, faint and almost sweet, something she could never quite name, something like glass heated past its bearing point. She had not noticed it before, or she had noticed it and called it something else. You're home, Clara. You came back. She cleared her throat and went inside. The first 3 days were ordinary enough. She sorted her grandfather's jars of seeds, labeled in his crabbed handwriting, cress, bloodroot, widow snap, touch not the glass. She noted that last one and set it apart. She boxed up his books, his hand tools, his collection of bird skulls along the sill. She found a photograph she had never seen. Her grandfather as a young man, standing near a kiln, a long iron pipe at his lips, and cheeks puffed full. His eyes were not looking at the camera. They were looking at something past it, high and to the left, with an expression Clara would later describe as reverence, or possibly dread. The longer she looked, the less certain she became there was a difference. She slept well those first nights. The mountain breathed around the cabin, slow and enormous. The wind moved through the hemlock and the sourwood like a hand moving through long hair. She did not find the root cellar until the 4th day. The cellar door was in the floor of the back pantry, beneath a braided rag rug placed deliberately over the iron ring that served as its handle. She might never have found it, but she dropped a jar of preserved beans and knelt to pick up the pieces, and her fingers found the rug's edge, and the rug's edge found the ring. The door sighed when she pulled it up, a long exhalation, like something that had held its breath for years and simply given up. The smell from below was cool, dry, mineral, like the inside of a geode. She went down. The cellar was small, 6 feet by 8. Shelves along 2 walls, holding old canning jars and a rusted hand drill. A single chain-pull bulb that miraculously still worked. throwing the space in watery amber glow. And there, on the lowest shelf, in a row as deliberate as church pews, 23 glass spheres, each one the size of an apple. Hand-blown, she could tell by the subtle asymmetry of them, the faint ripples in their surface that caught the light the way old window glass does, making the world behind them just slightly wrong. Each one sealed with a ribbon of darker glass wound round its neck like a gasket. Each one in a small wooden cradle, carved with a name. She picked up the nearest one, and she heard it. A heartbeat. Slow, utterly calm, 60 beats per minute, perhaps fewer, coming from inside the glass, from the trapped breath clouded within. A small, pale fog coiled at the sphere's center, like a sleeping thing. Don't tap the glass. Don't you dare tap the glass. She set it down with great care. She stood in the amber light for a long time. All 23 spheres were breathing, the tiny fogs within each one expanding and contracting. If you held your ear near enough, the shelf would produce a sound like standing near a sleeping congregation. 23 small hearts, slow as winter water. She read the names on the cradles. Some she recognized from her grandfather's stories. Hazel, Orrin, little Dorothea, old Burl, the McAfee twins, grandmother Solly. The oldest name was carved in deeper, older letters, as if the wood had grown around it. Silas Voss, 1887. Her great-great-grandfather. She found her grandfather's sphere last. She knew it was his before she found the newest cradle because she recognized the rhythm, that heartbeat she had heard her whole childhood. His chest rising and falling beneath her ear on Sunday mornings when she had been small enough to climb into his lap without shame. Elias, the cradle read, and beneath that, in letters she had to tilt the bulb to see, and trusted to the ridge, as agreed, as agreed, as agreed, as agreed. Clara went back upstairs. She put on her coat and boots. She went to the back porch and looked up at the ridge, black and immense against the last bruised light. And she saw, just below the tree line, a faint glittering, as though the mountain had begun quietly to snow from the inside out. Silica rain, the old man at the feed store had called it once, without explanation. Don't follow it up. It ain't meant to be followed. Clara followed it up. The glass dust drifted down through the hemlock in slow, scintillating curtains, each mote catching the last light and throwing it back in cold, white sparks. The sound of it, faint, constant, was like the highest string on a fiddle played with a hair-breadth bow, a sustained crystalline keen that sat just at the edge of hearing, just at the border between music and pain. The ridge had a way of making you feel the path had always been there. The rocks arranged themselves beneath her boots. The laurel pulled its branches back. Something at the top of the mountain wanted her there. She smelled it before she saw it. A heat like melted quartz, like the breath from an oven in which something crystalline was curing. Then the trees gave way. The workshop sat on a shelf of granite that jutted from the ridge like a chin. No wood in its construction. Every wall, every surface was glass. Clouded, thick, hand-blown glass of a gray-green hue, the same as old sea glass. The structure curved rather than stood straight, its roof a dome from which an iron chimney rose. Light came from within, something paler and steadier than firelight, the color of a moon seen through thin cloud. She pressed her hand to the door, and it swung inward, as if it had been waiting for exactly the weight of her particular hand. The sound inside the workshop was a world. Glass hung from the ceiling on iron threads, hundreds of spheres, perhaps thousands, each one clouded with a small breath of fog, each one contributing its heartbeat to a collective rhythm. Not cacophony, a deep, layered resonance that Clara felt behind her eyes and in her back teeth. The spheres quinked against each other, gently, endlessly, a sound like rain on still water, like a chime in a windless room. In the center of the workshop, before a furnace that burned without wood or coal or any visible fuel, stood the glass-blower, taller than a person has need to be, its skin with the color and finish of porcelain, glaze white, the white fired until all impurity is driven out. Its hands and fingers were long, and the iron pipe it held was an extension of those fingers, natural as bone. Its face was a face the way a mask is a face. The brow, the nose, the closed eyes, the lips pursed around the pipe's end, but carved still, too still. It knows your name. It knew your name before your mother did. It did not startle at her entrance. It did not stop. It was in the act of blowing. Its chest expanded with a breath that seemed greater than any single body could hold, as if the ridge itself were breathing through it. From the end of the iron pipe, a globe of molten glass swelled, orange, then amber, then the pale green of old sea glass, turning in the slow rotation of its wrist. A heartbeat began inside it. Clara heard it start from nothing. A first knock, tentative, the way a new heart sounds before it knows its rhythm. Then steadier, then certain. The glass-blower sealed the sphere with a twist of darker glass and hung it on the chandelier above. That vast, trembling constellation of captured souls spread across the workshop ceiling like a night sky made of frozen breath. Then its sealed eyes found her. She could not explain how a thing without sight could locate a person in a room, but it did, the way a flower finds the sun through a wall. The valley holds. While the chandelier holds, the valley holds. Has held since 1887. Will hold while there is breath enough to fill the glass. Clara's mouth was dry as clean sand. "My grandfather," she said. The glass-blower inclined its head. He agreed to this. The head inclined again. Then those long porcelain fingers gestured upward, to the chandelier, to the thousands of clouded spheres clinking in their slow glass song. Clara looked up and found the newest sphere, still faintly warm, still orange at its heart where the amber was cooling. Her grandfather's heartbeat, slow, utterly calm, still there. She stood beneath the chandelier for a long time. The mountain breathed through the glass-blower. The glass-blower breathed into the glass. The glass held the valley in its quiet, trembling arms. She did not touch anything. She did not tap the glass. She went back down the ridge as the first stars came out, cold, indifferent to the small, warm heartbeats clustering in the workshop above the tree line, and yet still shining, still holding their positions in the dark. Now lean in close, friend. Let me tell you what came after. Clara did not sell the cabin. There are some inheritances you cannot pass to a stranger. She returned each October, cleared the garden, put it back to sleep. She checked the root cellar. The spheres were always undisturbed, always breathing on their cradles. She never went back up to the workshop. On still mornings she could hear, if she held her own breath, the faint crystalline singing drifting down through the hemlock, like the world's most private music. In the spring of the 20th year she brought her daughter. The girl was 9. What matters is that she had her mother's steadiness and her great-great-great-grandfather's eyes. That particular gray, clear, unafraid. Clara told her everything on the porch the first evening, while fog came in off the ridge the way it always had, laying its shroud over the creek and the garden and the ironwork weather vane. She told her about the spheres, the glass-blower, the chandelier, the valley and what it rested on. The girl listened without interrupting. Then she said, "And when the chandelier breaks?" Clara held her coffee cup in both hands and looked at the ridge. "Your grandfather's jar of seeds," she said. the one labeled "Touch Not the Glass." The girl waited. "I think," Clara said slowly, "it is instruction, not warning." The girl turned to look at her mother's profile in the lamplight, and Clara's face was the same as the young man's face in the old photograph, looking at something past the camera, something high and to the left, with an expression that sat precisely at the border between reverence and dread. The valley holds. It holds. That night the girl dreamed of glass, not breaking, holding. All that glass holding in the dark, breathing. 10,000 small hearts beating their slow rhythms in the clouded spheres of the chandelier. The whole luminous weight of the mountain's memory suspended on iron threads thin as spider silk, clinking softly, one against the next, one against the next. The sound of it like rain on water, like wind through a chime, like a promise kept for 140 years that intends to hold for 140 more. She would tell her own children in time, and they would tell theirs, and the ridge would stand, and the glass-blower would breathe, and the valley would hold. Now close your eyes, friend. You've walked the ridge tonight, and you've come back down, and there's nothing left to do but let the dark have you, gentle and full, the way fog fills a hollow, the way glass holds what it's given. The all-night horror playlist is waiting just ahead, slow and quiet and patient as old stone. Let it carry you the rest of the way. Somewhere along the old mountain roads, this story happened. Nobody knows exactly where. Nobody who was there is talking. But it got written down, and it found its way here. The jar was dated 1944, in a hand that had pressed too hard on the wax pencil, each number slightly crooked, as though written in the dark, or by something that had learned the motion of writing, but not the reason for it. The lid was sealed with a red rubber ring gone brittle with age. and there was something inside that shifted when you tilted it. Not liquid, not solid. Something between the two. The way a memory sits in the chest. Present, weightless, impossible to set down. The cellar smelled of cold stone and old sweetness and something else beneath both. Something that had been breathing in the dark for a very long time. The jar did not rattle. It did not hum. It simply waited, the way certain things wait, with a patience that has no bottom to it. And when the fog came down off the ridge that evening, it found the door to the cellar already open. Now, settle in. Pull that blanket up around your shoulders. The story I am going to tell you happened slow, the way most true things happen. Not all at once, a little at a time, like frost working its way into the cracks of old wood. It begins in October, up in the Blue Ridge, at an elevation most people would call unreasonable for an apple orchard. The kind of altitude where the fog does not come and go. It simply lives there, drifting between the gray trunks like something that has forgotten where it was going. The orchard was called Bitter Apple Holler, though on no map you would find it labeled so. The locals just knew. The way people know things in the mountains, quietly and without wanting to discuss it further. A woman named Cora Veach had inherited the property from her mother's great-aunt, a woman she had met exactly once at a funeral when Cora was 7 years old. She remembered the woman as tall and dry-voiced and smelling of vinegar. The inheritance came with 4 acres, a frame house badly in need of repointing, and a root cellar that the estate paperwork described in careful typed language as containing personal effects and preserved goods to be inventoried at the heir's discretion. Cora arrived in early October, when the apples were long past their prime, going soft and dark on the branches in the gray light. She was 34 and recently widowed, and had no particular reason not to go. She told herself she would spend 2 weeks, settle the estate, and return to the lowlands before the cold set in. The fog had other notions. The house was cold and smelled of old calendars and something faintly sweet, the ghost of a smell, like sweetness pressed between the pages of a book left closed for decades. The wallpaper in the kitchen showed a pattern of small blue flowers, and Cora stood in front of it for a long while on that first evening, her coat still buttoned, feeling the particular heaviness that comes from standing in a house where someone else's life has ended and your own has not yet resumed. She did not go to the cellar that first night. She made coffee on the gas range and drank it at the kitchen window, and watched the fog settle into the hollow below the orchard until the apple trees disappeared entirely. Then she went to bed in the spare room, under a quilt that smelled of cedar and dried lavender, and she lay still and listened to the house, and eventually she slept. She went to the cellar the second morning, when the fog was low enough to blur the tree line into a smear of gray-green, and the late apples hung overhead like small brown lanterns going dark. The cellar door was set into the hillside behind the house, a wooden frame, painted red once, the color faded to a tired pink. She pulled it open and felt cold rise up from below, carrying the smell of stone and earthen walls and something sweetly organic. She descended the stone steps into the cool dark, and she found the shelves. They ran the full length of both cellar walls, rough-hewn pine shelving darkened with age and moisture, and they were full. Hundreds of mason jars, the quart-sized ones mostly, with their two-piece metal lids and red rubber sealing rings. Some were labeled in pencil on strips of white medical tape, others in wax pencil written directly on the glass. And all of them, every single one, contained something that caught the thin light from the doorway in a way that was difficult to account for. Not wrong exactly, but not right either. The contents of the jars were not food. That was the first thing Cora understood, standing very still on the stone floor with the cold settling around her ankles. There were no green beans, no stewed tomatoes, no apple butter, no pickled beets. What the jars held was difficult to describe by color or by texture. Some appeared to contain a kind of interior vapor, a soft misting that pressed gently against the glass from inside, like breath on a cold morning. Others held something darker, more settled, a density without form. One jar near the bottom shelf seemed to contain nothing at all. But when Cora lifted it and held it at eye level, she felt a sudden pressure in her ears, like the pop of changing altitude on a long descent. She set that one down carefully. She read the labels. January 1953. First snow heard on the roof. Weight heavy. Another, smell of the big fire, August 1931. Gone sweet by now. And another, smaller, the letters cramped together. The last of the quiet before the preacher came. 1967. Cora stood with that jar in her hands for a long time. The cellar was very still. Above her, moving through the orchard without a sound, the fog shifted. She did not open any of the jars, not that day. She simply moved among them, reading until the light through the cellar door had shifted to the color of weak tea, and the whole afternoon had gone without her noticing. That night, at the kitchen table, she found the ledger. It was tucked between the wall and the back of a drawer in the sideboard, the kind of placement that suggests either accident or intention, impossible to tell which after the fact. The ledger was cloth-covered, dark green, its spine splitting. Inside, in her great-aunt's compressed, angular handwriting, was a record. Column after column of dates and descriptions, a preservationist's log. But what was being preserved was not food. The smell of my mother's hands. 1929. Sealed, 3rd week of November. 1 quart. The silence after my brother's name was spoken for the last time in this house. 1941. Difficult to seal. Kept wanting to come loose at the ring. Required a second attempt. The bite of the January blizzard, 1920. Full body sensation. This one runs cold still, even in summer. Keep toward the back of the shelf. Cora read until the lamp needed tending and then read some more. She began to understand the shape of what her great-aunt had spent her long life doing here, alone, at this altitude, in this fog. The woman had been a keeper, not of food, not of memory in the ordinary sense, not photographs or letters or the sentimental clutter of a life. She had been capturing the raw sensory texture of moments, the physical fact of things that would otherwise dissolve entirely, the weight of a silence, the temperature of a loss, the smell of something that existed only once, and then never again. There was a word in the ledger for the process. Her great-aunt called it putting up. The same phrase mountain women have always used for canning. I have been putting up since before I understood what it was I was putting up. This was written on the first page, in ink gone brown with age, beneath the year 1924. And on the 3rd page was a section heading that Cora read twice before continuing. On the assistance of the hand. The entry was careful and precise, the way a person writes when they are determined to be accurate about something that may not be believed. The hand comes when the work requires it. It does not speak. It does not eat. It has the shape and proportion of a woman's hand and forearm, no more. It is pale, the pale of birchwood, not of illness, and it moves with a certainty that is restful to observe, the way a good cook moves in a familiar kitchen. It knows the sealing process. It assists with the lids when my fingers ache. It does not stay longer than the work requires. What it requires is a vessel. The jars must be sealed while held against something living. A wrist, the flat of a palm. The sensations do not spoil into loose haunting if they are sealed against the warmth of a living body at the moment of closing. The hand understands this. Cora put the ledger down on the table and sat very still. Outside, the fog had come fully down off the ridge. She could see nothing beyond the kitchen glass, only the thick, soft gray pressing close against the house. And somewhere in that gray, the intermittent sound of apples releasing from branches and falling into the dark below. She went to bed. She lay in the spare room under the cedar and lavender quilt and listened to the house settle around her. And she did not sleep for a long time. But when she did, she slept deeply, the heavy and complete sleep of high-altitude places, where the air has more weight to it than you are used to carrying. In the morning, there was a jar on the kitchen table that had not been there the night before. A quart jar, clear glass. The tape label read, October, this year. The sound of a widow settling into a strange house, first night. And inside, very gently, something moved the way smoke moves when there is no draft to prompt it. Cora sat across from the jar and did not touch it. She was cold. The stove had gone out in the night. Somewhere below her feet she could hear, or believe she could hear, the faint and periodic music of glass touching glass in the cellar dark. She went back to the cellar that afternoon with the ledger, and she read standing among the jars. And the longer she stood in that cool and ordered dark, the more she felt it. The sense of the place having a logic, an old and settled purpose. The way a good kitchen has a logic. Everything knowing its use. Everything in its correct relation to everything else. The whole of it making quiet sense that settles into the body before the mind has finished deciding what to think. The hand was there when she turned from the second shelf. Not dramatically, not suddenly. It was simply present at the far end of the shelving, moving a jar from one position to another with the careful deliberateness of someone who has done this work for longer than memory. Pale as the inside of fresh-cut birch, the fingers long and sure. It did not acknowledge her. It was working. Cora watched it. And she found, to her own quiet surprise, that she was not afraid. She was something closer to recognition, the feeling of watching a thing being done correctly, and knowing the correctness of it in your body before your mind has finished forming an opinion. She began to help. She held the jars steady while the hand sealed the lids. She pressed her palm flat against the cool glass and felt, each time, a brief and vivid passing, a scent, a temperature, the pressure of a particular silence, moving from somewhere outside comprehension through the glass, going still inside the jar. Each jar, when sealed, had a completed quality she had no word for. The way a sentence arrives at its final right word and everything settles. She had been working for 2 hours, perhaps, when she noticed the jar on the shelf nearest the cellar steps. It was recently sealed. Its tape label was fresh. October this year. The smell of cedar and old lavender. The weight of sleep in a cold room. She had not sealed that one. She had been sleeping when that one was sealed. She looked at the jar beside it. October this year. The warmth of lamplight on a turned page. The pressure of recognition arriving slowly. And the one beside that, October this year. The sound of a woman's breathing as it lengthens and slows toward sleep. Cora stood very still in the cellar. The hand continued its work at the far end of the shelf. The fog outside was complete and white and pressed its full, soft weight against the hillside and the house and the orchard. She understood then. Not the way you understand a simple thing all at once. The way you understand a mountain, piece by piece, as you move through it. She understood enough. The jars were not only keeping the old things now, they were keeping her. Each breath, each small movement through the cold rooms of the house, each quality of attention she brought to the reading of a page or the drinking of cold coffee at the kitchen window, all of it being put up, sealed against glass, set to cool in the organized dark of the cellar while the fog held the holler in its patient embrace. She reached for the cellar door. Her palm rested there a moment. The brief, warm fact of a hand against old wood. And somewhere behind her, she heard the soft, certain sound of a lid being seated and sealed. She climbed into the fog. She walked out through the orchard where the last apples lay in the grass, giving softly underfoot, past their ripeness, returning to the ground in their slow way. And in the cellar below the house, the jar of that moment was already cooling on the shelf beside all the others. And the jar of this one, and the one that followed, the work going on without her. She was already inside the jars. She was already being kept. The fog was soft. The mountain was patient. The hand knew its work. Sleep now. The Appalachian Mountains are older than most things on this earth. Old enough to have seen things we don't have names for anymore. This next story is one of those things. They're still in there. All of them. Every last one. Don't you look too long at the big one by the window. It ain't showing you yourself anymore. Hasn't been for I don't know how long now. Just keep your eyes low and follow what the ledger says. He wrote it all down. The old man wrote it all down. There is a particular kind of fog that lives only in the high hollows of the Blue Ridge. Not the thin morning mist that burns off by 9 o'clock. No. This is the heavy fog. The wet kind. The kind that presses itself against your skin like a second garment you did not choose to put on. The kind that has weight to it. Real substance. As though the mountain itself has exhaled and simply decided not to breathe back in. It was that fog that filled Reflection Ridge the evening I drove up the gravel trace to Aldous Vaughn's workshop. The estate company had sent me. That is all you need to know about my reason for being there. Aldous Vaughn had died, quietly, they said, in his chair by the work table, the way that very old men sometimes cease. No drama to it, no family to speak of. A neighbor 2 hollows over had found him after a week of no smoke rising from the chimney, and the county had turned the matter over to the estate office, and the estate office had turned the matter over to me. My name is not important. What I saw inside that workshop, that is what matters. That is what I need to lay down now, slow and careful, the way you lay down a sleeping child, so that every detail rests in exactly the right place and nothing is jostled loose. The workshop sat at the end of a rutted lane, hidden behind a stand of old-growth hemlocks that had somehow survived the blight that had taken their kin from the lower elevations. They rose up on either side of that lane like the fingers of 2 enormous hands pressed together in something that was almost prayer. The fog moved through them in long, slow ribbons, and in the headlights of my truck, those ribbons looked almost solid, almost purposeful, as if they were drifting toward the workshop rather than simply through it. I shut off the engine and sat for a moment, listening. Rain on a tin roof is one of the oldest sounds a person can hear, and it has layers to it. The sharp, bright percussion of individual drops, and underneath that, a lower, continuous wash, like the sound of a creek bed running fast after a long soaking rain. The workshop had a tin roof, and the rain was working on it steadily, and I sat in my truck and listened to that sound and told myself, quite sensibly, that there was nothing unusual about any of this. The front door was unlocked. The estate company had been given a key by the county office, but the lock turned out not to matter. The door swung inward on hinges that had been oiled recently. Within the last few months, I would have guessed. And the smell that came out to meet me was not the smell of a dead man's house, which I had prepared myself for. It was something older and stranger than that. Mercury, sulfur, and beneath those two, something I could not name with any certainty. A mineral smell, cold and faintly sweet, like a creek stone split open after a long winter to reveal what had been quietly growing in the dark inside it. I stepped inside. The workshop was long and narrow, running back from the door the way a hallway sometimes simply decides to become a room without announcing the transition. And on every wall, on shelves that ran floor to ceiling, on the work table that occupied the center of the space, on freestanding frames arranged in rows like a silent congregation waiting for a service that was long overdue, mirrors. Dozens of them, scores of them. Not the bright, clean mirrors of a department store or a hotel lobby. These were old mirrors. Old in the way that ridge country itself is old, carrying a darkness inside the glass that was not quite reflection and not quite shadow, but something that lived in the narrow space between those two things. The silvering on many of them had gone cloudy at the edges, retreating slowly toward the center of each pane, the way river ice retreats in the first true thaw of March, pulling back from the warmth in long, uneven fingers. In the light of my electric torch, the surfaces shifted in colors I did not entirely have words for. Pewter and smoke, and the gray-green of a deep mountain creek running cold in November. I moved slowly down the center of the room, and this is where I need you to hold something carefully in your mind. The mirrors lagged. Not all of them, and not all at once. But as I walked that narrow corridor between the shelves and the standing frames, I would catch, in the corner of my vision, in the peripheral place where the mind is most honest, the movement in a mirror that came a half second, perhaps a full second, behind where I actually stood, as though the glass had to think about what it was receiving, as though my image was traveling to it from somewhere slightly further away than the distance between my body and its surface. I told myself it was the warping of old glass. I I told myself it was the quality of the torchlight, its movement creating tricks of tired perception. I told myself a number of sensible things, and I kept moving, and the rain kept working on the tin roof above me, and the fog pressed itself against the workshop's 4 small windows with what I can only describe even now as patience. The work table at the center of the room held Aldous Varne's tools, arranged with a kind of deliberate care that speaks of long habit. Silver nitrate solution in dark brown glass bottles, each one labeled in that careful, old-school hand. Soft cloths folded into precise squares. A hydrometer. A thermometer in a wooden case. A mixing bowl in which the ghost of the last batch of silvering agent had dried into a thin, iridescent film along the bottom, catching my torchlight and throwing it back as something faintly violet. And beside the bowl, a ledger. Not the neat spiral-bound kind, a hand-stitched ledger, the cover made from leather that had been stained to near black by decades of handling, worn smooth along the spine and the corners in the way that only a thing reached for constantly, a thing consulted the way some people consult Scripture, ever grows smooth. I set my torch on the table, angled it so the beam fell across the open pages, and I leaned down to read. The handwriting in the first section of the ledger was small and deliberate. The handwriting of a man who had been taught that a letter carelessly formed was a form of small dishonesty. There were receipts there, dates going back 40 years or more, names of customers from towns and hollows and gap communities I recognized from my work with the estate office. Ordinary commerce. The records of a craftsman who had built a modest, quiet life from a modest, quiet trade. But somewhere near the middle of the ledger, the handwriting changed. It did not become less careful. If anything, it became more so, as though the writer understood that what he was setting down in this section required a precision that bookkeeping never had, that a mistaken word here carried consequences that a mistaken measurement in a silvering solution never could. The heading at the top of that page read, in letters pressed so firmly into the paper that they were nearly embossed from the reverse side, True Reflect Protocol for the keeping of windows. Do not deviate. I will tell it to you the way the old man wrote it, in the same slow, considered rhythm he used, because I believe he chose that rhythm the way a careful doctor chooses the exact words they will use to deliver serious news to a patient who is not yet ready to hear it. The mirrors, he wrote, were not mirrors. That is to say, the glass was real. The frames were real. The silvering agent was real, made in the old manner, with mercury and nitric acid and tin chloride, the same as any good-looking glass had ever been prepared. But the purpose of the finished object was not reflection. The purpose was containment. He wrote about the fog of Reflection Ridge, the particular fog, the high, hollow fog, the wet fog with weight to it. He wrote that his grandfather had first noticed, long before Aldous himself was born, that certain things moved through that fog. Not animals, not people. Things that had the approximate shape of a person, the way a shadow cast by an odd-shaped skep or a lightning-blasted stump has the approximate shape of a crouching figure. Close enough to reach some old, unguarded part of the mind, not close enough to be mistaken for the real article by anyone who looked directly. His grandfather had called them the mist-kin. The older folk of the ridge country, going back further than any living memory, had other names for them. Gap shadows, hollow shapes, names that described what they were without pretending to explain it. The word that appeared most often in Aldous' ledger, the word he had settled on after what appeared to be years of careful consideration, was simply the others. The others were drawn to glass, to any reflective surface. They pressed against it from outside, from whatever outside they occupied, which was not the outside a person walked through when they opened a door onto an ordinary mountain morning, and they looked in. And if the glass was not properly prepared, if the silvering had thinned or worn or been applied without sufficient intention, they could, given enough time and enough patience, begin to press through. The silvering agent was not merely for reflection. It was a seal, a barrier. Applied correctly, in the old sequence, with the correct ratios and the correct unhurried intention, the silver layer on the backing of the glass created something the others could not pass, something they could lean against and press against, and apply the whole of their considerable, cold patience to, and it would hold. Every mirror Aldous Varn had ever sold to a customer in the hollows and the gaps and the small ridge country towns had been made this way, each one a properly sealed surface, each one placed in a home or a business or a schoolroom so that the others, who were everywhere, always, once you knew to look for the lag in the reflection, once you had learned to watch for that half-second of delay, could press themselves against the glass all they wished, and be held there. He had not been making mirrors. He had been making windows. And every window he made was a small, sealed jail cell, tended quietly, without any ceremony, without any recognition, for more than 40 years. He had been a jailer. A very long pause, filled only by rain on tin. And the mirrors in this workshop, the unsold ones, the ones that had never found homes, the ones that had been here the longest, These were the holding cells that had grown the most crowded. The ledger did not, in that section, attempt to quantify what each pane contained. It used instead a word I had to read 3 times before I accepted that I was reading it correctly. Congregation. I became aware of the pressing before I looked up from the ledger. That is the only way I know to describe it. Pressing. A sense of accumulated, patient weight gathering in the room around me. The way you feel a space filling with people behind you even before you turn to see them. It came on slowly, and it was unmistakable. I raised my eyes from the page. Every mirror in the workshop had shifted. Not in position. The frames had not moved an inch, but in the quality of what was held within the glass. The lag I had noticed on first entering had deepened into something else entirely. What I saw in the mirrors now was no longer any version of the room I was standing in. No longer any version of me. In every pane, pressing close against the glass from the far side, were shapes. Not monstrous shapes. Not the hard-edged, sharp-clawed things of the nightmares a person carries up from childhood. These were soft shapes. The shapes of presences that had been standing inside mountain fog for so long that the fog had begun to fill them up, to round whatever edges they once possessed, to soften anything that had ever been specific or particular about them. They pressed their palms flat against the glass from the inside, and I could see the impressions clearly. The way you see a handprint left on a cold window by someone who has already walked away. And they leaned toward me with a patience so old and so absolute that it was more unsettling than any urgency, any hunger, any sharp and obvious threat could ever have been. The ledger had a final section, written in darker ink, applied more recently, within the last year, perhaps the last few months, as though Aldous had known toward the end that someone would need to read this. For whoever comes after me, if you are reading this, it means I did not finish the final round of resilvering before I went. The agent is already mixed and waiting on the table. The sequence is written below. You must coat each pane before the sun is fully down. When the fog reaches its full depth at true dark, the seal on older glass grows thin, and what is held inside grows restless. Work slowly. Rushing wastes the agent and breaks the intention the work requires. Speak a name aloud for each window as you coat it. Any name you choose, a name you know or a name you invent, so that the glass understands it is being kept and cared for and held. Do not make direct eye contact with what is pressing from the other side, not because they mean you harm, but because if they believe you can see them clearly, they will press harder. and old glass has limits that younger glass does not. Start now. There is still time if you start now. And so I did. I lifted the mixing bowl from the table. The silvering agent Aldous had prepared, silver nitrate and reducer in the proportions his grandfather had passed down, moved in the bowl like something alive, like liquid smoke captured and contained, folding and turning on itself in slow, continuous motion. The same gray-violet as the inside of a storm cloud seen from far below. I took up the soft cloth. I began at the furthest mirror, the smallest one, set into the back corner of the workshop where the shadows gathered deepest. I drew the cloth across its surface in slow, long strokes, the way you stroke a restless animal until it stills. And I named it. I called it patience, the way you name a thing you want to keep. I worked my way forward, pane by pane, frame by frame, and the shapes on the other side of each glass subsided as I coated it, not disappearing, not fleeing, but simply growing still, growing calm, settling back into whatever depth they occupied, the way a tired child finally settles when a familiar hand is laid, without urgency, upon its shoulder. By the time I reached the last mirror, the tall one by the door, the one the voice on the recording had warned about, the sun had dropped behind the ridge line, and the fog outside had gathered its full, wet weight against every window in the workshop. I named the last one. I called it Aldous. I drew the cloth across in long, unhurried strokes, and the liquid smoke spread across the old glass in slow waves. And the shape behind it, the shape that had been pressing there the longest, the shape closest to the surface, the most patient of all, slowly, slowly laid its palm flat one final time against the inside of the glass. And then it, too, grew still. The rain keeps on. The ridge country keeps its own long, unhurried time, unbothered by what moves through its hollows and its shadow pockets and the deep places between its old, dark peaks. The fog settles into the gaps for the night, the way it always has, the way it always will, heavy and slow and full of things that do not require a name to be true. The mirrors hold, for now and for as long as the silver holds, they hold. Sleep now. The glass is sealed. The windows are kept. This one was never meant to leave the hollow it came from. But here it is. Make of it what you will. Settle in now. Pull whatever warmth you got a little closer. What I'm about to tell you was found on a tape, a VHS cassette, the kind with the paper label peeling up at one corner, the ink gone brown with age. It was tucked inside a leather-bound ledger. The ledger was found inside a forge. The forge sits at the top of a hollow the old maps still call Cold-Anvil Gap, up in the eastern ridge country, where the mountains fold in on themselves like sleeping hands. Nobody goes up there much anymore. I'm going to tell you why. The one who found the ledger, we'll call them the inheritor, because that's what they were, had driven up the mountain road in early October, when the leaves had gone the color of old copper, and the fog sat so low in the gap you couldn't see the ridge line from the turnout. They had inherited the property from a grandfather they barely remembered, a quiet man, a man who smelled of iron and coal smoke and said very little, but watched the corners of rooms the way some men watch the horizon. The cabin sat back from the road by a quarter-mile of rutted track, and the forge sat behind the cabin like a second, darker thought. The inheritor parked, sat in the car for a moment longer than necessary. The silence outside was the wrong kind of quiet, not the peaceful quiet of a hollow at rest, but the held breath quiet of something waiting to see what you'll do next. They got out anyway. The cabin door was unlocked. It always had been, the grandfather had said once, in the only letter he ever wrote. The door is never locked. A locked door is a judgment, and we don't make judgments about what needs to come through. They hadn't understood that then. Inside, the cabin smelled of pine resin and dust, and something underneath, something mineral, the way the inside of a well smells, or the back of a cave, cold and old and patient. On the table, beside a lantern with no oil left in it, sat the ledger. It was bound in leather, gone dark as charcoal, and the pages inside were thick, cream-colored, hand-stitched. The handwriting was deliberate, careful. The handwriting of a man who had learned to write late in life and treated each letter like a thing of consequence. On the first page, in that careful hand, for whoever comes after, read slow. This work requires understanding before it requires hands. What follows is what was written in that ledger, and what was spoken on the tape found folded inside its back cover. The voice on the tape is the grandfather's. It is slow and measured, and it never raises above a murmur, as if he were afraid to wake something. There is a trade, the old man says on the tape, that most folks have forgot, and that's by design. The forgetting was intentional, made it safer for the ones who didn't need to know. But this trade has to be kept up, has to be passed down. If it isn't, things start to drift. Let me tell you what I mean by drift. You know how, on a real cold morning, the fog sits in the hollows like it's been poured there, thick and gray and still, and how the hollow looks not like itself, but like a copy of itself, like something learned what a hollow looked like and tried to make one, but got the details slightly wrong. That's the gray spaces talking. That's them pressing up close. The mountains, these old mountains, older than the names we've put on them, they sit right up against something else. Not another place exactly, more like the absence of place, the gray spaces, where the drifting things live. Most times, the stone and the soil and the cold iron in the earth holds everything in position, tethers the world to itself. But houses, structures, they're delicate. They sit on the skin of things, and without proper anchoring, they begin to move. Not all at once, slow, the way a boat tied with a bad knot drifts from the dock. You don't notice until you look up and the dock is further away than it ought to be. First the corners go soft, then the threshold starts to feel uncertain. Then one morning you wake and the light through the window is the wrong color, and the sound of the wind is coming from a direction that doesn't exist on any map. That's when you know the house has started to go. The nail-smith's work, he continues, is to forge the anchors. 7 nails, specific iron, specific method. You drive them into the 7 thresholds, the 2 door frames, the 4 window sills, and the hearthstone. Done right, they tether the house to the living world. They say, this place is here. This place is real. The gray spaces cannot take it. Without them, without someone keeping up this work, every house in this hollow would eventually drift, and everything inside it. I'm going to tell you the method now, exactly as it was told to me, and as it was told to him before, going back further than the names I know. First, the coal. You don't use wood. Wood burns too bright, too quick, too alive. The old way uses coal, the dense kind pulled from the seam on the north face of the ridge where the sun never gets warm enough to matter. You build a fire slow, in layers, the way you'd build anything that needs to last. Let it breathe up through the draft of the bellows in long, patient draws. The forge takes about 20 minutes to reach the right heat. You'll know it's ready not by looking. Looking at it directly will ruin your night sight, and you need that. But by holding your hand at the edge, palm down, and counting. When you can only count to 3 before it becomes unbearable, it's ready. Second, the iron, cold iron. And I don't mean that as a manner of speaking the way some folks use the term. I mean iron that has never been worked, never been shaped for any other purpose. You can feel the difference in it. It has a density to it that reworked iron doesn't have. A weight that pulls toward the earth rather than sideways. The old way says this is because cold iron still remembers what it is. It hasn't been asked to be anything else yet. You let the rod sit at the edge of the heat for a full count of 60 before you move it in. Third, the silence. You don't speak while you're working. Not a word. Not even to yourself. The work requires all of you. Not just your hands and your eyes, but the part of you that usually fills silence with noise. You have to bring that part quiet. The gray spaces listen for voices. A voice is a thread, and they will pull on it. The hammer you use is the one I've left hanging on the south wall of the forge. Do not use any other. It was weighted specific. The head is heavier than it looks. The old man who made it said the weight was for respect. Said the iron needs to know it's being worked by something serious. The inheritors set the ledger down at this point, it seems. There are water rings on the page here, from a cup set down and picked back up several times. The marks of a person sitting with something for a long while before deciding what to do with it. Outside the cabin window, the fog in the gap had thickened while they read. The corners of the room, they noted this later in the margin of the ledger in their own handwriting, the corners of the room had begun to look soft. Not dark exactly, not shadowed, just imprecise, as if the right angles weren't quite holding their confidence. They went out to the forge. The path between the cabin and the forge was only 20 feet, but the fog had thickened enough that the forge's iron door appeared slowly, the way things appear in dreams. First a shape, then a certainty. The ground underfoot was soft, not muddy, but soft in a way that felt deliberate, as if the earth itself was paying attention to what walked across it. An owl called once from somewhere up the ridge, then did not call again. The door of the forge was cold to the touch, colder than the air around it. The inheritor pulled it open anyway. The coal was already there, stacked and waiting, the way the grandfather must have left it. The bellows were stiff at first, Old leather, the seams re-stitched with what looked like wire. But they moved. They always move when they need to. The fire built slow. This is worth dwelling on because it's the part that matters most and the part that gets rushed in the telling. The fire in a working forge doesn't leap. It doesn't roar. It builds the way conviction builds, slowly, from the center outward, establishing itself in layers until it reaches a heat so steady and deep it no longer needs to announce itself. You feel it before you see it, in the skin of your face, in the backs of your hands. The coal popped once, settled. The light it threw was red-orange, the color of last light on a sandstone cliff. It turned the interior of the forge the color of old amber. And in that light, the tools hanging on the walls, the tongs, the hardies, the swages, they cast long, still shadows that didn't move even when the fire breathed. The cold iron rod was on the shelf where the ledger said it would be. It was heavier than it looked, considerably heavier. The kind of weight that makes you adjust your stance without thinking about it. The inheritor placed it at the edge of the heat, counted to 60, and brought it quiet. The part of themselves that usually filled silence with noise. The first nail took a long time. The hammer, the one from the south wall, heavier than it looks, rose and fell in a rhythm that wasn't exactly chosen. It settled into the work the way a rocking chair settles into its groove. Rise and fall, rise and fall. The iron glowing yellow-white at the tip, cooling toward orange at the shank, the sparks jumping off the anvil in small, lazy arcs. The smell of hot iron is not like any other smell. It is mineral and clean, the way a struck match is clean, the way the air before a storm has a keenness to it that is also a kind of warning. It filled the forge and it filled the lungs, and it settled somewhere behind the eyes where the world becomes very simple. Strike, turn, strike. The first nail took shape the way the old man said it would. Not sharp at the tip so much as tapered, the way a tooth tapers, the way a root tapers down into the earth it is meant to hold. It cooled in the slack tub in a hiss of steam that smelled of iron and old water. 5 more times the process followed the same unhurried shape. The fire never faltered. The rhythm never broke. There is something in repetitive, careful work that empties the mind of everything unnecessary. Worry, grief, the low, persistent noise of ordinary life. It all burns off, the way dross burns off iron, leaving only the task and the heat and the weight of the hammer in the hand. On the 6th nail, The inheritor paused before the final strikes, not from doubt, from something closer to recognition, the understanding that the seventh would be the last, and that after the seventh, the work would be real, and the world would know what had been done here. They finished the sixth, let it cool, drew the seventh rod from the shelf. By the time the seventh nail cooled, the fog outside the forge window had pressed itself flat against the glass. The driving of the nails is not described in the ledger in great detail. The old man's tape runs out before he gets to it. But the margins of the ledger, the same handwriting as the inheritor's watering notes, tell it in short, careful sentences. First threshold, east door frame, nail set flush, felt the frame solidify somehow, like it had been uncertain before and was not anymore. Second threshold, west door frame, same. Third through sixth, the 4 windowsills. By the fourth, the corners of the room had come back to right angles. Seventh nail, the hearthstone. By the time I set the last one, the fog had pulled back from the glass, not lifted, pulled back, like something withdrawing, like something that had come very close and was now deciding to wait a while longer. The house felt present. That's the only word. Present. Like it knew where it was. There's a note at the very back of the ledger, in the grandfather's hand. Just a few lines. The gray spaces are patient. They don't want to harm anything. They just want what they've always wanted. More room. And the world, if you let it, will give it to them. Inch by inch. Hollow by hollow. The nailsmith's work is not glamorous. It is not remembered. Most of the people whose homes you anchor will never know your name or understand what kept their world from softening at the edges. But you'll know. When you drive the seventh nail and you feel the house settle and you hear the quiet take on a different quality, a present quality, a located quality, you'll know you've done what needed doing. Don't let the trade die. Pass it down. There are more hollows than there are hands to tend them, and the gray spaces are always, always patient. The ledger is in a library now, a small one, in a county seat that doesn't advertise itself. The forge at Cold-Anvil Gap still stands. Someone still tends it. The nails are still driven each season. And the house, if you were to drive up that rutted track on a cold October morning and stand at the threshold and lay your hand against the door frame, you would feel it, solid, present, exactly where it is supposed to be, as it should be, as it always should be. Sleep now. The house you're in is tethered. The corners are holden. The world knows where it is tonight. Let yourself drift, but only in the safe way, the way of sleep, the way of rest. The gray spaces are far from here, and the cold iron holds. And that is where we leave it for tonight. 6 stories from the old hills. 6 things that happened or didn't happen, or happened in ways we still can't account for. The mountains aren't saying. They never do. If you made it this far, I'm glad you stayed. There's something to be said for sitting with the dark and not running from it. You did that tonight. The archives will be here when you come back. There are more stories where these came from. There always are. The hollows run deep, and I've been digging a long time. But for now, you rest. The fog can wait until morning. This is the Redacted Archives. Good night.